The wooden benches of the courtroom creaked under the weight of curious townsfolk, their whispers rising like dust in the air. All eyes were fixed on the young woman standing alone at the front, the adopted daughter of a powerful rancher, now stripped of his name and cast out as though she had never belonged. Her face carried no tears, only a fire long hidden beneath years of silence. To the crowd, it seemed like the end of her story, a cruel rejection in front of the law. But she stood straighter, her hands steady, as though she carried a truth heavier than any verdict could deliver. The rancher's voice echoed harshly across the chamber, cold and resolute. He declared that she was no child of his, that his home and his name would never shelter her again. The words cut deeper than any blade, slicing away the fragile bond she had clung to for years. Gasps rippled through the crowd. From the Wild West, bloodlines were everything. To be cast aside meant to wander as no one, with no place to belong. Yet beneath her stillness, a storm gathered, and those who watched could feel that this trial was about to turn into something far greater. For years, she had carried a secret, a truth she had been forced to bury under shame and fear. But in that moment, with the whole town gathered and the judge's gavel heavy above her fate, she found the strength to let it rise. Her voice, though calm, carried across the courtroom like a bullet through silence. She spoke a name, not the rancher's, not the one who raised her, but the man whose blood truly ran in her veins. The air shifted instantly, the name ringing out with the weight of a legend, one whose shadow stretched across the plains. The judge froze, the townsfolk murmured, and even the rancher's proud shoulders seemed to falter. For this was not merely a daughter abandoned. This was a legacy revealed, a truth that tied her not to shame, but to a lineage that could not be denied. Her revelation was not revenge, nor a plea for pity, but a declaration of who she truly was. In a land where survival often depended on silence, she chose the dangerous path of truth. And as the courtroom trembled under the power of her words, the story that began as disgrace transformed into destiny. The rancher had disowned her, but in doing so, he had freed her to step into an identity greater than his pride could ever contain. At dawn that day, she had been an outcast. By sunset, she stood as the daughter of a man whose very name would change everything. The Wild West had always belonged to those bold enough to claim their place in it. And at last, she had. The silence that followed her words was heavy, almost unbearable. The name she had spoken carried power that no one in the room could ignore. Some gasped, others whispered, but most simply stared, as though they had just seen the walls of their world shift. The judge leaned back, his eyes narrowing, realizing that this case was no longer about a rancher's pride or a daughter's place in a family. It was about bloodlines, legacy, and a secret that had the power to turn the balance of power in the territory upside down. The rancher's face hardened, his jaw clenched as if carved from stone. He had raised her, fed her, clothed her, but not out of love. He had taken her in out of duty, perhaps guilt, perhaps fear, and now that she dared to reveal the truth, he saw her as a threat. His voice thundered through the courtroom, accusing her of lies, of deceit, of trying to tarnish his name. Yet the fury in his eyes betrayed something deeper, fear. For he knew the man she had named, and he knew what it would mean if the world believed her. The townsfolk shifted uneasily in their seats. They remembered that man, a figure once spoken of in hushed tones around saloons and campfires, a man whose reputation for both justice and wrath stretched across counties. If her claim was true, then she was not just an abandoned girl. She was the rightful heir to a legacy greater than the rancher's empire could ever match. Some pitied her, others envied her, but all waited to see if she could prove the weight of her words. The young woman stood tall, though her heart thundered in her chest. She had not chosen this path for glory, nor for revenge. She had chosen it because she was tired of being silenced, tired of being told she did not belong. Her voice had cracked open the truth, and now she could not turn back. In that courtroom, surrounded by doubt and hostility, she held onto the only thing that gave her strength, the knowledge that she carried her true father's blood. Outside, the desert sun burned hotter, the air thick with dust. It was as if the very land itself knew a storm was coming, not of rain, but of revelation. And though she stood alone, Her courage was a spark in dry grass, ready to ignite a fire that could not be contained. Word of the courtroom revelation spread through the town faster than wildfire on the prairie. By sundown, every saloon, every trading post, and every dusty street corner buzzed with the same whispers. The rancher's adopted daughter had spoken a name that could not be ignored. Some spoke of it as scandal, others as prophecy, but no one dismissed it. In the Wild West, names carried power like bullets, and hers had just been loaded into the chamber of destiny. The rancher tried to tighten his grip on the town, ordering his men to silence the talk, to crush the rumor before it grew. Yet the harder he pushed, the more people wondered what he was so desperate to hide. Fear bled through his arrogance, and the townsfolk could smell it. A man who had once been untouchable now looked over his shoulder, and every glance revealed his crumbling pride. Meanwhile, the young woman walked through the streets with her head held high. She could feel the stares, the judgment, the doubt, but also something new: respect. Those who once saw her as a stray now looked at her with curiosity, even awe. She had dared to stand against the man who raised her, and to speak a truth that threatened to change the very order of things. That kind of courage was rare in the West, and people remembered it long after the echoes faded. Yet courage alone was not enough. To prove her claim, she would need more than words. She would need evidence, allies, and the will to face enemies who would rather see her buried than acknowledged. The rancher, driven by fury, vowed that she would regret the day she ever opened her mouth. And behind his threats lay the promise of violence, for in the frontier, disputes were rarely settled by judges and gavels. They were settled by guns. As the sun set over the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of blood red and gold, the town felt the tension rising. It was no longer a simple feud between a father and a daughter. It was a battle between truth and deception, legacy and lies. And in the heart of it all stood a young woman, armed only with her voice and the strength of a secret that could reshape the West forever. By the next morning, the story had outgrown the courtroom. Cowboys riding in from distant ranches spoke of it, as if it were a legend already carved into the dust. Merchants leaned over their counters to trade rumors, and mothers whispered it while hanging laundry, their voices tinged with both awe and fear. The rancher's adopted daughter had spoken a name that turned the world upside down, and with it came the weight of history pressing upon the present. In the West, the past was never buried deep enough. Sooner or later, it always clawed its way back. The rancher tried to maintain control, to silence the waves that her revelation had sent crashing across the land. He barked orders at his men, threatening anyone who dared repeat her claim. Yet his fury only fueled the whispers. A man who truly held power did not need to silence others. He was obeyed without question. His desperation betrayed him, and the townsfolk saw the cracks in his pride. They had followed his shadow for years, but now they questioned whether that shadow could withstand the light of truth. The young woman, meanwhile, felt the weight of eyes upon her wherever she walked. She was no longer invisible, no longer the quiet figure who had moved through town unnoticed. Every glance carried expectation. Some looked to her for strength, others for proof, and a few for failure. But she walked with her chin high, the echo of her father's name steady in her heart. For years, she had hidden in the corners of silence. Now she stood where silence could not reach. Yet behind the murmurs of awe, danger grew. Old rivals of her true father, men who had long envied or feared him, heard the news and stirred like rattlesnakes in the brush. If she truly carried his blood, then she was more than a girl. She was a claim, a banner, a spark that could reignite battles thought long buried. And if her father's enemies could not reach him, they would reach her instead. The West had always been a place where names meant more than deeds, where blood could lift or bury a man before he even drew his first breath. But she had done what few dared. She had spoken a truth that could not be unsaid, and now, for better or worse, she had set herself on a path where the echoes of her revelation would chase her until the end. It was not long before the judge himself summoned her back into the courthouse, this time not as a castaway, but as the center of a storm. He demanded clarity, documents, testimony, proof that the name she had spoken was more than a desperate claim. The rancher sat across from her, his glare sharp as a blade, while the crowd once again filled the benches, eager to see the next chapter of a drama greater than any dime novel. The air smelled of sweat, ink, and anticipation, heavy enough to choke. Her hands trembled as she laid out the letter she had guarded for years. Crumpled pages, stained with time, written in the unmistakable hand of the man she had named. Each word spoke of promises, of a love once forbidden, of a daughter hidden to protect her from enemies who would have torn her life apart before it began. Gasps filled the room as the letters passed from hand to hand, their truth undeniable. The rancher's face drained of color. He had raised her under his roof, but never out of devotion, always under the weight of another man's shadow. And now, with every letter read aloud, his hold over her dissolved. The crowd turned restless, some murmuring sympathy for her, others muttering curses for the rancher's deceit. The balance of power shifted in that very moment, not by gunfire or fists, but by words written years ago, now brought into the light. Yet with truth came peril. The man whose name she revealed was not just a figure of respect. He was a figure of conflict, surrounded by allies and enemies alike. To claim him as her father was to inherit both his strength and his enemies. And as she stood there, proud but weary, she understood that her fight had only begun. For the Wild West was never kind to those who carried great names. It lifted them to the heights of legend, but it also placed a target squarely upon their backs. And now, with the whole courtroom as witness, she had stepped into a destiny that would demand every ounce of courage she possessed. The town changed overnight. What had once been a place of dusty routines and quiet survival now pulsed with tension. Some saw the young woman as a beacon of justice, a living reminder that truth could rise even from the ashes of betrayal. Others feared the chaos her revelation would bring, whispering that her father's enemies would descend upon them all. The saloon filled with speculation, gamblers betting not on cards, but on whether she would live to see another month. In the West, a story this big was never just a story. It was a spark that could ignite an entire frontier. The rancher withdrew into his estate, his pride shredded, but his hatred sharpened. He had lost control of her name, but he still held power over men who would kill for his coin. Rumors spread that he was gathering gunslingers, planning to silence her before her claim spread any further. The people watched his gates, saw riders come and go, and felt the air grow thick with the promise of blood. The young woman, however, refused to vanish into hiding. She walked openly through town, each step a declaration that she would not be erased again. Yet every shadow felt longer, every whisper heavier. She knew her strength lay not in weapons, but in the truth she carried, and truth was a fragile shield against bullets. Still, she held her head high, for she believed that destiny favored those bold enough to stand unshaken. The judge, sensing the storm about to break, offered her protection under the law, but even he knew the law had little reach in a land ruled by fear. Outlaws did not wait for verdicts, and power did not respect courts. He urged her to leave town, to vanish before the rancher's men made their move. But leaving meant surrendering her place, her voice, and the claim that had cost her everything. And surrender was a wound she refused to bear. By the week's end, riders arrived at nightfall, their silhouettes cutting against the burning horizon. They did not come to talk. The people of the town shuttered their doors, praying the storm would pass them by. But deep inside, they knew the West had always been defined not by peace, but by the moment when courage stood face to face with power, and neither blinked. The confrontation began not with a gunshot, but with silence. The riders dismounted in the town square, their spurs striking the ground like the ticking of a clock. They carried no banners, only the weight of menace in their eyes. At their head stood the rancher's most trusted gunman, a figure whispered about in fear, a man whose hands had sent more souls into the dust than anyone dared count. His presence alone was a warning. The rancher would stop at nothing. The young woman faced them with a calm that surprised even herself. She had no weapons, no allies, no army. But she had the truth, and in her mind, that was stronger than steel. Her voice cut through the night air as she demanded they let her speak before they carried out their orders. It was a gamble, a plea not for mercy but for witness. For if she was to fall, she would fall with her truth echoing through the town. The gunman sneered, his hand hovering near his revolver, ready to end the matter in a single motion. But the crowd had gathered in the shadows, drawn by curiosity and fear. And in their eyes, he saw something dangerous, doubt. If he struck her down in cold blood, the story would not die. It would grow, turning her into a martyr and her name into fire. For the first time, the power of silence pressed against his trigger finger. The rancher himself emerged, his face twisted with both fury and desperation. He shouted that she was nothing, that she was a liar who sought to tear apart everything he had built. Yet his words rang hollow, for she held the letters, the proof, and the fire of conviction. She stood unflinching, daring him to deny her again before the eyes of the people. And in that moment, even those who doubted her could feel the balance shifting. The standoff stretched into eternity, the dust swirling like smoke around them. The gunman's hand trembled, the rancher's rage boiled, and the young woman's steady gaze held it all at bay. The West had seen countless duels, but this was no ordinary fight. It was not about bullets or blood. It was about truth, and whether truth could stand against the empire of fear. And as the night deepened, the people knew they were witnessing the birth of a story that would outlive them all. The dawn crept over the horizon like a slow-burning fuse, casting long shadows across the town square. The riders still lingered, their presence heavy, their horses restless, as if sensing the weight of what was to come. The young woman stood tall at the courthouse steps, her cloak wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her eyes fixed not on the rancher, but on the people watching from behind shuttered windows and half-opened doors. She knew her strength no longer came from solitude. It came from the witnesses who would carry her story, whether she lived or died. The rancher's fury boiled over. His voice cracked through the morning air, condemning her as an impostor, a stain on his legacy, a girl too foolish to know her place. Yet each insult only made his desperation clearer, and the townsfolk began to see the cracks in his armor. A man secure in truth did not rage so violently. Only a man cornered by lies fought with such venom. His empire of pride was collapsing, brick by brick, undone by the courage of the very daughter he had tried to erase. The gunman at his side grew impatient, his fingers twitching near his revolver. He had killed for less, ended lives without hesitation, yet now hesitation gnawed at him. For every eye in town was upon him, every whispered breath holding him accountable. If he drew his weapon now, it would not be justice, it would be murder. And the West, though cruel, had no tolerance for cowardice. He felt the pressure of history in that silence, pressing heavier than the weight of the gun itself. The young woman raised the letters once more, her voice steady as she read them aloud, each word carrying across the square like the tolling of a church bell. Promises of protection, words of devotion, and confessions of bloodlines written by the man she claimed as father. The crowd stirred, some nodding, some gasping, the truth wrapping around them like wildfire. In those fragile moments, her story ceased to be rumor. It became fact, spoken and proven in the open air. By the time she finished, the silence that followed was not disbelief, but awe. She had not only defended herself, she had exposed the rancher's deceit, torn his pride into dust, and planted a seed of legend in the minds of everyone who stood there. The rancher's face was pale, his breath ragged, his power slipping like water through clenched fists. And the people of the town, once his loyal shadows, began to step into the light of her truth. That night, the saloon brimmed with voices, the sound of boots stomping on wooden floors, mugs slamming against counters, and names whispered with reverence. Her name. No longer was she the orphan child, the discarded daughter, the stray hidden beneath a rancher's roof. She was the blood of a man whose legend had shaped the frontier, a legacy long whispered, now reborn in flesh and voice. The West thrived on stories, and hers had become the story that held every tongue. But legend came with danger. Across the plains, word traveled fast, carried by riders who owed allegiance to no one but greed. Her father's old enemies, some still nursing wounds from battles long past, now had a new target. If they could not destroy the man, they would destroy the child who bore his name. In smoky taverns and outlaw camps, plans were made, and the promise of coin sharpened every blade. Her revelation had not only freed her, it had painted a mark upon her back. The rancher, humiliated and broken, retreated into the shadows of his estate. Yet vengeance smoldered in him like embers in dry grass. He had lost his claim over her, lost the respect of the town, but he had not lost his hunger to control. Alone in his grand house, he plotted with clenched fists, swearing that if she would not bow to his name, she would fall beneath his power. The West had little mercy for the weak, and he vowed she would taste its harshness without his shelter. The young woman, however, did not waver. She knew the road ahead would be paved with blood, betrayal, and sacrifice, but she also knew that destiny never favored the silent. With her father's letters as proof and her courage as shield, she prepared herself not only to survive, but to claim the place that was hers by birthright. She had been denied, disowned, and threatened, yet each wound had only tempered her into something unbreakable. And so, as the moon rose over the plains, painting the land in silver light, the people whispered her story by lantern glow. It was not just the tale of a girl cast aside. It was the tale of a daughter who found her voice, a woman who dared to name her blood, and a truth so powerful that even the wild West itself seemed to bow before it. The following days turned the town into a cauldron of suspense. Riders carried her story far beyond the dusty streets, and strangers began arriving not for trade, but to witness the woman who had defied the rancher and revealed her true father's name. Some came with admiration, others with suspicion, and a few with intentions dark as night. The saloon brimmed with gamblers wagering on her fate, and yet beneath the noise, there was a silence, the kind that comes before lightning splits the sky. The rancher could not bear it. Once a figure of authority, now he was seen as a man who had tried to bury the truth, only to be undone by the very daughter he disowned. His pride, sharper than any blade, cut him from within. He plotted behind closed doors, his fury festering into desperation. If he could not erase her words, he would erase her existence. He sent for men who lived outside the reach of law, guns for hire whose loyalty was bought with gold, not honor. The young woman knew danger circled closer with each hour. Still, she walked the streets openly, her eyes unflinching, her presence daring anyone to silence her again. She was no longer the hidden girl clinging to borrowed identity. She was a voice carried by the wind, stronger than bullets, stronger even than fear. Her defiance became a beacon to others who had lived in silence, and the people began to whisper of standing with her should blood be spilled. But whispers alone could not protect her. One evening, as lanterns flickered along the dirt road, the sound of hooves thundered closer. Men cloaked in shadow, rifles across their saddles, halted before the courthouse. Their leader, face covered in dust and scars, declared that justice would be served that night, not by law, but by fire. The townsfolk froze, torn between terror and duty, watching the line between survival and courage grow razor-thin. She stood before them all, letters clutched in her hands, and raised her voice once more. "You may kill me," she said, her words steady as stone, "but you cannot kill the truth. The blood in me cannot be silenced. And if I fall, my father's name will only burn brighter." Her voice cut through the air like a bell in the wilderness, and in that moment, every man, outlaw or townsman, felt the weight of a story that could outlive bullets. The night exploded into chaos. The hired guns moved forward, their boots striking the ground like war drums. But the townsfolk, stirred by her courage, stepped from the shadows. Men who had once bowed to the rancher raised their rifles. Women stood with lanterns glowing like stars against the dark, and even children clutched stones in their fists. The square filled not with silence, but with resolve, and the outlaws suddenly realized they were not facing a girl alone. They were facing a town awakened. The rancher himself rode into the square, his face twisted with rage, his voice booming that she was nothing but a fraud. Yet no one listened. His power, once unchallenged, crumbled beneath the sight of his own people standing against him. He drew his revolver, aiming it at the daughter he had cast away, but his hand shook, not from weakness, but from knowing that his legacy was already lost. The young woman stepped forward, her shadow cast long beneath the lanterns, her voice carrying like thunder across the night. She did not beg. She did not yield. She spoke her father's name once more, louder, prouder, and in that moment it was no longer just blood that bound her to him. It was destiny. The townsfolk roared in agreement, their voices rising together until it drowned out the crack of her father's pride. The outlaws faltered, their loyalty dissolving in the face of overwhelming defiance. Some dropped their weapons, others rode away into the darkness, unwilling to fight a battle already lost. The rancher sat on his horse, broken and hollow, surrounded by the very people who had once feared him. His empire of silence was gone, and in its place rose the voice of the daughter he had tried to erase. And so, under the endless sky of the Wild West, a new story was born, not of a girl abandoned, but of a woman who claimed her place in the world. Her courage rewrote the order of power, her voice forged a legend, and her truth became a torch that lit the path for all who had ever been told they were nothing. For in the frontier, where dust and destiny met, it was not blood alone that made a legacy, it was the fire to speak it aloud. The dust of that night did not vanish with the dawn. It lingered in the streets, in the whispers of the people, and in the memory of a young woman who had chosen to stand when silence would have been safer. She had been cast aside by the man who raised her, yet it was his rejection that unlocked her true strength. By daring to speak her father's name, she reshaped not only her fate, but the fate of everyone who witnessed her courage. What began as disgrace ended as a legacy reclaimed. The rancher, once feared, became a shadow of himself, while his daughter's name spread far beyond the boundaries of the town. Her story proved that power built on pride crumbles when confronted with truth, and that courage often emerges from the most unlikely of hearts. She had nothing when she walked into that courtroom. No wealth, no allies, no certainty. And yet, she left it carrying something far greater, the recognition of who she truly was. The Wild West has always belonged to those who dared to carve their place into its unforgiving soil. Her voice, clear and unwavering, reminded everyone that destiny is not dictated by others, but claimed by those who refuse to be silenced. The strength of her stand lies not just in the name she revealed, but in the message she carried, that no one can erase a truth that burns inside the soul. And perhaps that is why her story endures. It is not simply about a rancher or a courtroom. It is about the fire of identity, the fight for belonging, and the unshakable will to be seen. She taught us that even when the world casts you aside, your voice can rise above the dust and echo louder than fear. In the end, she was not just her father's daughter. She became her own legend. If her journey moved you, let her courage live on through your voice. Share your thoughts in the comments. Let your heart speak as hers did, and help keep stories like this alive by subscribing to the channel. If her defiance inspired you, show it with a like so others may discover it too. For just as her truth found its way to the light, your voice today can carry this story further than the frontier ever imagined.